This week marks International Fraud Awareness Week. 77% of South African organizations have experienced economic crime over the last 2 years, and this figure is substantially higher than the global average of 49%. To talk about how to fight fraud, I'm joined by Krevania Pillay from Cliff Decker Hofmeyr. Good morning to you.
Thank you for having me, Jane.
Terrible that we are that high a percentage when it comes to fraud.
Indeed, it's quite a sad statistic, much higher, as you mentioned, than the global average.
Why?
Well, I guess it's a myriad of factors. Our positioning in sub-Saharan Africa, our high immigrant population, and our economy being susceptible to instances of fraud and corruption. I think as an emerging economy, it's something that we do face.
Okay, so I mean, why do those factors that you've mentioned play into the fraud thing? What is it about people that are not from South Africa, for example?
Well, I think, in the South African context, we've seen fraud and corruption permeate both the private and the public sector, which is quite a scary fact. And, in that regard, in sub-Saharan Africa, we're quite an emerging economy in comparison to our South African in comparison to our other African counterparts. Mm-hmm. So our geographic location, the strength of our economy in comparison to our African counterparts, as well as our high immigrant population, really does all contribute to instances of fraud, corruption, and financial crime. All
right. So what can we do about it? How do we spot it before it takes us down?
Absolutely. I think, and this is really what Fraud Awareness Week is all about. It's bringing awareness to anti-fraud and anti-corruption initiatives, both on an individual and an organizational level. And it's a lot simpler than it sounds. For organizations, for an instance, there are several things that they can do to increase awareness of fraud amongst their employees. So I think a starting point would be conducting a fraud risk assessment, to having a look at the risks faced by that particular organization. And these risks definitely do vary from sector to sector. And each fraud risk posed against an organization would be unique to that organization's sector, its operations, and its speciality. Another thing, and a very important thing, is having a whistleblowing policy in place. So having an environment where employees feel safe and free to come forward with their concerns and reporting their concerns relating to fraud. Another thing, and something that's really simple, is having a training session or webinar to increase awareness amongst employees relating to instances of fraud and corruption.
One of my previous guests was telling me that internal auditors often raise concerns, mm-hmm. and then they are pushed out of their job. They're bullied. I mean, that's a problem in South Africa, isn't it? So you encourage whistleblowing, but often that's not what the company wants to hear.
You're quite right, because when it comes to whistleblowing, it's a very tentative subject. And in South Africa, we're fortunate to have the Protected Disclosures Act, which enshrines from a legal perspective the rights of whistleblowers. So whistleblowers should, according to the letter of the law, have an environment where they can come forward freely with their concerns without fear of reprisal or occupational detriment as a result. Obviously, it's a perfect scenario, and that's not always the case.
No.
But I think as individuals and employers, we should really encourage our whistleblowers to come forward and report instances of fraud and corruption.
I mean, who do we look to internationally to help guide us, or is there, I should imagine there isn't one fix for all countries?
No, I think that, and this is really where Fraud Awareness Week comes from. It's from an international body, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which is a leading body in relation to anti-fraud initiatives, as well as best practice in the field of the detection and prevention of fraud. And this campaign, Anti-Fraud Awareness Week, right, is really aimed at making the issue of fraud and corruption an issue that employers and individuals take ownership of, and really brings it to the fore, brings it to our mind as something that we can really apply ourselves to prevent and mitigate at an organizational level through taking organizational measures, but also on an individual level to encourage employees.
What are we most likely to become victim of away from a corporation?
So that is something called occupational fraud. And, the biggest threat or risk to an organization is its own employees, its own directors, its own officers. And why, you may ask, is it our own employees that pose the biggest threat? It's simply because these are individuals in positions of trust. they have access to sensitive information, to companies' intellectual property or to data. So as a result of that position of trust, you know, they are the ones most likely to perpetrate fraud. A scary, scary fact.
It is indeed, but thanks for talking to us about it, Krevania Pillay.
Only a pleasure.
Thank you very much.